the curators of the Jakarta Biennale, and it gives me great honor to actually be part of today's session that we have. This is one of our Jakarta Biennale 2021 ESOK, our monthly event that we host on our curatorial blog. And then it's part of our effort as well to work with collaborators and practitioners that we know in the region and outside the region to speak about different thematics and research that they are currently doing and that has to do resonate with our current circumstances today. So for today, we are very honored to actually present Concealer, a program that moderated by Wong Binghao. Just a short blurb that we have is that Cosmetic and Commonplace, a surface that both masks and performs a self. Concealer is an instructive method to think about the promises and the disenchantments of positionalities in personal and professional life. This conversation will be about gender, diaspora, and art, and will be between Wong Binghao, Jaya Jacobo, and Sriwhana Spong, whom we have today. Wong Binghao enjoys communicating between contexts and mediating art to diverse publics. Eclectically constellate ideas, scenes, art, and writing as a gesture towards ethical and expansive cultural work. This practice currently takes form in a series of publications, such as Indifferent Idols in 2018, Nominal Bliss in 2019, and Forthcoming in 2021. These publications attempt to generate contextually specific, conceptually capacious, and emotionally available readings of art. They are currently CMAT Asia Fellow at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. So without further ado, please welcome Wong Binghao.
Hi, thank you so much, Tini, for the really kind introduction. I'm really happy to be joining you for this program. I'd just like to say a few things before we begin. Firstly, it's unfortunately due to a personal emergency, Daniel is unable to join us today. I know that they really wanted to be here with us and share their work with everyone attending. So we are sending our warmest wishes to them and their family. So before we begin, I would just like to take a moment to thank the people and the sponsors who have made this event possible. Firstly, thank you to the Jakarta Biennale team, Ibu Dolo, Tin E, Farah, Grace, Chita, Rachel, and Sally for your invitation and the openness to having this discussion in your program series, which I'm really excited to continue following in the coming months. Thank you, Studio Vanessa Ban, for the design of the publicity image, which was actually taken from Nominal Bliss. And it's, Vanessa and her team really helped to design the publications with me collaboratively. So I'm really grateful for that partnership. My gratitude extends as well to my colleagues at MoMA. The work that you'll be hearing us share a little bit about today was really facilitated and made possible through the many discussions and events that have taken place during the course of my fellowship. Most importantly, I would just like to thank the panelists. We are all in different time zones. So Shri and Daniel couldn't be here, and Jaya, and I just want to acknowledge their time and the effort that they've put in during what has been a most difficult year for all of us, especially with our recent relocations, our new jobs, our lockdowns, and then no lockdowns. So I'm most of all really grateful for the many conversations that we've had over the past year. And when I was invited to do this program, I immediately thought of it as a really amazing opportunity to continue the work and the conversations that we've been having. And now that we're all here together in this capacity, I'm sure that our collective dialogues will take on a totally different texture. So now, before we hear from the speakers, I'd just like to go through a couple of brief community guidelines, as well as like a rough rundown for today's event, which I feel like will be helpful for everyone. So in today's event, we will all be speaking from our own personal experiences, and we invite you to do the same and share your personal responses too. So for the next hour or so, Sri and Jaya will introduce themselves and their respective projects that we've specifically thought about for the purposes of today's event. We will think together about gender, diaspora, arts, and Southeast Asia, and the promises and disenchantments of subject position in our personal and professional work. After that, we will have a moderated discussion of about 20 minutes to think about how their practices really intersect and maybe even diverge. And then we will open up the remaining time of about half an hour or so to discussion and question from the audience. And this is where I feel like we are all really excited to hear from everyone. I believe you can ask questions via the Q&A or the chat function on Zoom or via our Facebook live stream. So please don't hesitate to send your questions throughout the talk, not just at the end, and we will be sure to get to them. In total, the event today will run for about 2 hours. So we really appreciate your time being here with us today. So without further ado, I think I'll pass the mic to the speakers to kind of introduce themselves. So maybe Jaya, you want to go first?
Hi, I am Jaya. I am a Filipino trans woman, but I'm based in the UK right now. I'm so happy to be here.
Sri?
Yeah. Hi, my name's Sriwhana. I'm an artist based in the UK from New Zealand. And yeah, thank you for having me. And yeah, I look forward to sharing with Jaya our work. Yeah.
Hey, so I think on that note, perhaps we can get started. And so what I'll do is I'll share my screen and yeah, I will pass it on to Jaya and then Sri, and we'll have a lot of time to hear what they're working on. So I will just share my screen. All right, so Jaya, I will pass it on to you.
Okay. Thank you, Bing. So good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I would like to thank the Jakarta Biennale for this invitation to speak and for Bing for gathering us together today. I'm honored to share the stage with Danielle and Sri. The forum is entitled around the trope of concealment from the immediate context of maquillage and onto the question of gender in art, scholarship, and community work. Studying makeup early on, I had been taught by practitioners that every time a face is made up, the countenance at hand must allow itself to be erased or defaced, if you like, so that a new face can arise to introduce the self upon the world. Nonetheless, as maquillage creates face upon face, makeup must not craft the face as if it were a mask. The artifice must be hidden, the concealer erasing an aspect of the facial canvas so that the painting can appear commonplace, as Bing had phrased it. Nature, Charles Baudelaire writes in The Painter of Modern Life, is imperfect, and art, by way of makeup, only rectifies such errors on the human face. A trans argument on beauty, one can queerly say. This tension between concealment and apparition is one that informs my work as an author of art, an interloper by way of critique, and a comrade within a community. I am a Filipino trans woman educated in the Philippine capital and in the heart of American Empire, who is now working in the United Kingdom. This morning, I recall a constellation of engagements which somehow plot out my journey so far and the paths I envision to move forward toward further modes of gender nonconformity. In early 2019, my colleague Paul Sumayo and I launched BKL, Bicol Bakla, anthology of gay, trans, and queer Bicolnon writing. The collection featured writings and art of gender diverse folks from the Bicol region of the Philippines. We wanted to make a point on the vernacularity of gender identity and the kind of desire that could disseminate itself from such a situated form of knowledge. We took up the idea of region and locality as a chance to engage global categories of gender variance from the discourse of the Bakla, assigned male at birth but feminine identifying bodies who could be proud both of their legibility and translatability. Soon after, I would start collaborating with Mikey Inton Campbell and Brenda Rodriguez Alegre, colleagues at the Society of Transsexual Women of the Philippines, or STRAP, to start gathering writings and art for Trans Pilipinas, anthology of writing by trans and gender diverse Filipinos, to be published in 2022. BKL provided me with a space to write in Bicol, my mother tongue. I mainly write in English and Filipino, the national language. Through a poem intuited from the autochthonous intelligence of Oriol, the serpent woman figure in the Bicol epic Ibalon, I was able to begin developing a manuscript that revisits the question of indigeneity, not from native essence per se, but from my positionality as a trans feminine figure in the present. This access to vernacular gender and sexuality enabled me to converse with other femmes inhabiting cities and islands of my homeland, which I would never have had a chance to speak with if I had continued speaking in my imperial languages. I would also find myself working with poet and film director Christian Cordero, critic Tito Valiente, scholar and filmmaker Dada Docot, and actress Sue Prado to produce a video based on the poem as part of Himati, a poetry and film series that was aired for months during the first year of quarantine in the Philippines. 3 years earlier, in late 2016, South Korea-based Filipinx poet BBP Hosmilio invited me to join their editorial team to launch Queer Southeast Asia, a transgressive journal of literary art. With Cyril Wong of Singapore, Panky Take of Kuala Lumpur, and Henry Julius of Jakarta, we engaged ourselves and colleagues to initiate and sustain conversations on gender and sexuality in Southeast Asian writing and art. It was quite a challenge at the start to scope the region for artists to participate, but engagement has been accelerating since late of last year that we shifted from biannual issues to monthly ones. What is inspiring in my work in QC is the instruction in how the aesthetic reveals so much about comparative possibilities. For example, between Manila and Jakarta and Kuala Lumpur and Bangkok and Phnom Penh, even from the most concealed positions in our disparate histories. Today, I'd like to share with you one of our features at QC, the photographic project of Indonesian artist Nico Hariano, in collaboration with the Warias of Yogyakarta, specifically at the Pesantren Waria Al-Hatta, an Islamic boarding school organized by Warias for Warias, by Shinta Ratri for sisters in the city and beyond. This South by South trans for trans approach has been replicated in other parts of Asia, for example, in Pakistan and Bangladesh. Shinta's work, as mediated by Hariano's gaze, argues with sheer force and homespun wisdom how trans pedagogy is most possible and even more persuasive outside the neoliberal paradigms of Euro-American Soji. The last image I would like to share with you depicts myself and my best friend. I'm sorry. Okay, I lost my text. Okay.
It's okay, take your time.
Yeah. Here we go. Sorry about that. The last image I would like to share with you depicts myself and my best friend Maria Rafaela Silva, who is also a trans woman academic artist activist. This picture was taken a few minutes before we left Casa Grande, a trans club in the outskirts of Rio de Janeiro. For a couple of months in late 2019 and early 2020, I was living and working in Brazil as part of a fieldwork residency sponsored by Goldsmiths College in London through funding from the UK government. With Maria and other transsexual women and travestis, I was involved in archivistic community engagement, gathering testimonies from Black trans women in the favelas and documenting their modes of resistance and re-existence in everyday life, as well as in aesthetic practice, scholarly pursuits, and community work. Almost every weekend, Maria and I would visit trans clubs in Rio Centro, Nova Iguazu, and Bangu, meeting fellow transsexual women and travestis, documenting their performances and our conversations with them on beauty, love, and the modes of sufferance we employ in the most dangerous city for trans women in the world. Suffice to say, it was also in these trans clubs that Maria and I encountered various cisgender men who could only love transgender women in the dark and do so tenderly. We were planning to scope other locales like Fortaleza, Natal, Salvador de Bahia, and Sao Paulo to construct a cartography of the Brazilian night alongside our auto-ethnographic project on trans beauty and longing. But that phase will have to be continued after this contagion still haunting us. My Brazilian experience coordinates the work that I have done in the Philippines and Southeast Asia, and in Southeast Asia, as it provides a third moment in the southern path toward trans self-discovery. It is a point that seems unexpected and unlikely for the most part, but in the end, only fortuitous and most opportune for a community whose members finally find sorority when they depart from all manner of nation that has abandoned them in the first place. In trans, we find a region of confluence where common gender empowers us to forge trans feminist alliances. To conceal and then to appear, that seems to be the rhythm of visibility and camouflage that trans women internalize and embody to make their way into the world. It is a tactic most replete with risk as well as pleasure. I would like to believe that the aesthetic is a principle that guides us to move forward or step back, whether or not we find compassion as we remove the mask and reveal our face, our true face. Mabalos, obrigada, terima kasih. Good afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Jaya. You're so poetic as always. I really appreciate it. And there are so many things because I've read the work that you and Maria have done. So I have a lot of questions. But I think on this note, maybe it's good to keep running and then we can kind of come back to the questions later. Sri, would you like to take us away?
Yeah. Hi. Thank you, Jaya. That was beautiful. And yeah, thank you for having me. And I kind of want to start with a little text because sometimes I feel like different languages are appropriate for saying different things at different times. I was given Sriwhana, spelled Sriwhana, by my mother, who spelled it wrong, or rather chose to misspell it because she thought it looked better with a tall letter. The H is an axe that severs Sriwhana, Sriwana, and renders it wrong, a slice and a suturing that forever marks my position as near to but distanced from my Indonesian heritage. It cuts and connects like a slice in film. The arch of H opens up a passage into the severance it makes, through which grammatical correctness absconds. On the chair of H, I navigate this misspelling, whose wings extend on either side, looking for a place to land. H cleaves my name with a hole breathed into it on the whim of my mother and writes a new one, or perhaps marks me as hers. She speaks with her mother tongue into my father's tongue and corrodes it with her breath. She defaces it, makes it her own. Her tongue, his tongue, little rocks, little knots in a net, never mixing. They form the ecology of I-land. This lowercase I-land is I and place, and the movement between us, marking our intimacy and distance. For a body like mine, evicted by a question, just waiting for the bus, here comes the man about to serve me my notice. Where are you from? New Zealand. Yes, but where are you really from? Evicted by a question, I clutch fragments of island, like a clacking skeleton made from the city's late night leg bones, my 2 a.m. chicken clacking half gnawed, with deep fried skin still flapping. These are the monsters fragments make. Yes, but where are you really from? I hold up my monster chicken, an egg conceived on a pack saddle that leaves at dawn. Silt sinks to the bottom of a life, a riddle to now sift through. What is the measure of the distance that makes me inauthentically a New Zealander? The measure of the distance that makes me authentically a New Zealander. Dropped in a Balinese context, a man once wrote in a review, a double riddle. What is the measure of the distance that makes me inauthentically Indonesian? The measure of the distance that makes me authentically Indonesian. Futile questions, equations designed to never add up, but to keep me busy with the working out. Also, dropped from where? B, where does one context begin and another end? C, how far is too far? D, how close is not close enough? E, and for whom? Trinity Minha writes, of all the layers that form the open, never finite totality of I, which is to be filtered out as superfluous, fake, corrupt, and which to be called pure, true, real, genuine, original, authentic, which indeed, since all interchange, revolving in an endless process. Also, every path, capital I/lowercase I, take is edged with thorns. Self-exoticization, asks the curator. An elusive identity is suspicious. A young girl stuffs cut up images inside her head. So this is a work just as an introduction to the work I'm going to talk about, this is the work I made in 2006. Kind of my first work out of art school. It's called Mutnik. And basically, I was raised in New Zealand and I didn't meet my Indonesian family till I was about 15. So this work, I was kind of exploring this idea of authenticity or in authenticity, what was mine and what wasn't, what could be mine, what couldn't, what I could play with, what I couldn't. So I was really fascinated in the Balinese offerings that my family would make. So I took the form and the material and I played with the form and remade them in my parents' garden back in Auckland, and then filmed them on Super 8 so it looked like tourist footage. And I guess in a way they're kind of like self-portraits where the function is lost in the translation or in the transition across into New Zealand, into a New Zealand context. So this was kind of an early work where I guess I was playing with kind of place and so, but the work I do want to talk about, and I guess it shows was one I made in 2019 called The Painted Tailor. And it's a very different kind of work, and it's the first work I've actually filmed in Bali. It took me, what's 19 minus 6, like 13 years. It took me, not good at math. It took me 13 years to kind of feel comfortable making a work in Bali, feel ready to make a work in Bali. And I think that happened as I explored my filmmaking process, as I kind of, I guess, worked out a method of making films that could kind of take into consideration distance, that could play with intimacy and distance. And that kind of actually came through my research, weirdly, into my love of mystic writing by medieval women from the Middle Ages. And Michel de Certeau talks about their writing as scripts of the body. So they're these writings of movement that document the body as it moves towards or is moved by another. And I became really fascinated by the style that's created by this kind of this translation of a body as it kind of tries to get close to something, but also understands the futility of ever fully knowing. And so the style we have, which is based on experiential knowledge, and kind of where genres kind of get really kind of like mixed and kind of move between each other, of fiction, autobiography, and complex thoughts. So this kind of created, I guess, a methodology through which I could begin to make films where they're not films about a subject. I kind of view them more as they're scripts of my body, or a documentation of my approach towards another, towards a subject. And yeah, and kind of acknowledge, and I film everything myself. I tend to film everything myself. If I'm in front of the camera, I will get someone else to film it, but it generally is somebody that I know. And this way, it's a way of keeping the film, I guess, or the view from my body, making that apparent in this kind of partial, contradictory, situated view, to quote Donna Haraway, I guess. But so this film, The Painted Tailor, it's a film where I approach my grandfather, I Gusti Mado Rundu, who was a Balinese painter. So I wanted to, so my family home in Sanur has his last painting. They have one painting of his in the house that my father doesn't want to give away. So I kind of focused on this painting. I wanted to disrupt my single perspective, my frame. That's something I'm aware of, or I guess I'm aware of, is my being raised in New Zealand and going to art school in Auckland, and I guess, being educated within a Western art history that's given me, a particular way of framing things. And so my family, my brothers and sisters, some of them are photographers in Bali, so I asked them to help me film it. There's one scene where we all kind of bring the painting out ceremonially from the bedroom and place it in the courtyard where he used to paint, where my grandfather used to paint. So that was filmed by me, my brother and my sister, and also Alaska the dog. So we attached a GoPro to the dog's neck. I think you can see that. Yeah. So this kind of footage was like, it's like my favorite, because you get this like pink, like tongue kind of hanging out over the frame. But what's really beautiful about this footage as well is that the animal, Alaska's just moving. He's not focusing on anything. It's not, it's just wandering around. So you get this really amazing sense of the location. Alaska captured, that's my brother Wong Su with the camera, and my sister Angan just behind the pillar. So it was also, Alaska was also able to capture my family filming it, myself filming it. Yeah, and then there were other, with my films, I tend to use different technologies, so 16mm HD video in my iPhone, because they allow me to kind of capture images in very different ways, and they create a different way of kind of being with the body, with the camera. So with the iPhone, I can be a lot more spontaneous. With the 16mm, it takes a lot of planning, and with, you know, HD video, it's more economical and you can repeat things. And I also like to, and each technology has its own history and its own type of, it creates its own image and its own texture. Like 16mm creates this kind of richness that only chemicals held in animal gelatin can create, and digital videos, there's these kind of very strict pixels, and I kind of see them on the timeline as kind of like these rocks, but also these windows, these particular scenes that open up onto other scenes and are changed by the scene next to them, and but also quite specific in their own way. So this, when I was there making the film, my sister Angan showed me this scrapbook. So this image is from a scrapbook by the anthropologist Claire Holt, who was, she wrote a book, she studied art in Indonesia, and so this is her scrapbook, the scan of her scrapbooks in the library, the public library in New York. And so this is my grandfather here and my father as a young boy. And it's kind of amazing to see this image. I've never seen a photograph of him. This is the only one I've seen, and it's quite strange to see a family member in this kind of, in the scrapbook of this anthropologist online. And so this is actually a recording of my desktop as I flick through it. I'm kind of quite intrigued by the scrapbook. She studied, she also wrote a lot about dance, and actually looking at it and the rhythm of it and the repetition of images and like the same image but different forms is super interesting. And I would quite like to make another work that kind of looks at this particular scrapbook. But and then Bing, I think there's a photo of my dad holding up a sheet. Yeah, so I also pulled in where I studied, I did my master's at the PSVA in Rotterdam, and when we were there, we visited the Tropen Museum in Amsterdam, which is quite a strange place, but it's kind of their museum to the colonies, the Dutch colonies. But they have this online archive of images that you can look at that are, it's like, yeah, it's quite big. And I was interested in these images of Indonesia where crops were separated out from their surroundings by a sheet being held up, and it was in this kind of separation from surroundings, and it was an image that stayed with me for some, yeah, and I wanted to use it for something. And so we played around with it at my dad's house and just held the sheet up in front, behind different plants in the courtyard. And yeah, was there another image being, oh, the dogs. So this is another texture, double exposure on 16mm to create a kind of more dreamlike space. And then the dog and the chair. Yeah, and that's the painting. And so the painting is based on a 12th century Javanese poem called the Bowman Taka. And in the first stanza of the poem, the unknown poet prays that their poem becomes a temple or an architecture in which the god of love can come in and dwell. And I love that idea, I guess, of text becoming an architecture that holds something. And yeah, I was wondering, this is just as part of a text that kind of wonders about, you know, if a painting can be a temple, also what it can hold. What's kind of interesting about this painting is that you can see there's like a little insect in the area between the figures. Yeah, there. And in traditional Kamasan painting, there are those motifs called ayon ayon, which I kind of like, I guess, Adrian Vickers, the historian, writes about them as like dust particles or haze to show, I guess, representing that there's no such thing as still space, as emptiness. But what's interesting is I think my granddad's turned them into insects, and which Adrian Vickers said he hadn't seen before and might help identify other paintings of his. But yeah, I mean, it was really, I also deliberately filmed the whole film in the family compound or in places that directly linked to the courtyards. So a lot of the audio is the sound of bats. Owen Pratt, who did the audio, he suggested I get a bat detector, which lowers the frequency of bat echolocation so that the human ear can hear it. So throughout the film, you hear this kind of, it sounds like submarines or something. It's quite amazing. And so I would record these bat sounds as I went for my morning walks with my father. And yeah, so everything we filmed was kind of in this very kind of personal local space. Yeah, I think that's the work. Yeah, yeah.
Thanks, Shri. Yeah, I didn't think that everyone was going to be so poetic today. It's quite unlike our individual conversations. Yeah, thank you both so much. Maybe at this point, I will stop my screen share. Okay. So thank you both so much. I feel like there were so many points of entry into the work, but I guess I had a question for each of you, because I feel like already within the presentations, there was such a, the question of perspective came up a lot. And I think both of you did talk about that explicitly, and, you know, how you reflexively negotiate that in your own practice. Jaya, I was really interested to hear more about Bicol, and, you know, because then we really started talking about this like region specificity, which is something that I've been thinking a lot about in my own work, which is like, how do we translate, you know, these things like Sriwhana was talking about, like, you know, when you receive information and education from one source, how do you transmit it or contextualize it into another source? And that's what I thought of when, you know, you were talking about Bicol. And then subsequently, when you were talking about, you know, South by South, trans for trans, like in an article, in a series of articles that you're writing with Maria Silva, how do you feel like that, you know, specificity can translate to, you know, these kinds of like South by South models, or do you feel like it's a totally different thing, like, for you?
Wow, Bing. Tough question, but I will try to parse it out. Okay. Yes. But before I begin, I would like to send my words of appreciation to Shri as well. What a wonderful presentation! Thank you so much, Shri. Yes. I thought of summoning these categories of region to begin from the region, because I'm not home, and so to speak. So I'm trying to situate myself in a new biome, if you want to call it that way. And but this is a place that's supposed to be safer for me because of my identity. I long for home. I long for my region, but it is whenever I long for it, it is a site of trauma. But at the same time, there's so much, as I recall, and as I review that memory of my region, everything, there are things there that are authentic and that I find useful and powerful as I path a trajectory outside of it. And it is in BCall that I learned, that I understood the notion of the South, of something outside the capital. We were learning so many things about Manila and many other capitals in the world, like New York, Paris, London, Berlin, from that locality. But in that locality becoming more enlarged as it receives these images from the world outside, it also becomes smaller and smaller. It also became a place that I wanted to leave because of certain provincialities that I felt were coming onto me as a person who was expanding. So, but as I expanded in Manila and in New York and now in Britain, I'm confronted with these categories of gender diversity, such as trans, which somehow empower me, but at the same time belittle me because these are terminologies that were born and raised in specific milieus that did not really include me. So I summon the vernacular, the bakla, and there are many vernacular forms of gender that are situated and rooted in many parts of Southeast Asia, like the bizu, in Indonesia, that I take inspiration from as I affirm myself as a transgender woman. So to answer your question, so to speak, I find the region within the Philippines and the region that I access through Southeast Asia and through the global South in Brazil as forms of a new cartography, which enable me to path a movement by myself and with other gender diverse women who are also experimenting on modes of expression, not just in art, but also scholarship, but most of all in community work, where all these things are happening. So these may seem disparate, BCall, Southeast Asia, and Brazil. But in my mind, and within the community that I consider my region, which is the trans community, all of these are coherent and wonderfully choreographed. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that was so, it comes so naturally to you. But I appreciate it because it's one of those things that you were saying, it is an intentionally rhetorical question in the sense that I'm interested in, like parsing through when the registers, right, of, you were talking about the local, the regional, and then the global. Like, I'm interested in parsing out, what are these kinds of registers and how, the subject, not a universal subject, how a subject moves through these different registers. And I think actually that's I will come back to this because there's so much to talk about, the idea of nature, something that you've talked about in the work. That is another thing that we could talk about with Shrewsbury. Yeah. But I think on that note, it's really great to hear that you're like, my region is the trans community, which is so kind of like evocative of a kind of specificity, but also an expansiveness. That's what I'm really interested in, like, as a method, but also in your work, like it's a practice, you know, it's a lived practice. I think on that note, I really want to move to what she was talking about, you know, which is like this, again, in like a really poetic text, like that I've actually, did you write that for this talk, or was it like, is it like kind of something that you're like ruminating about? Like, I'm curious to know.
I wish I could say I wrote it for this talk, but I wrote it for what some institutions call a thesis.
Oh, okay.
Recently.
I see. Yeah, no, I mean, it's interesting because oh.
Being mute, I'm really sorry.
Sorry.
Yeah, we lost you for 30 seconds.
Sorry. I think my computer just shut down. But there was that point that you mentioned about like the Balinese context, you know, like the double riddle of like this critic saying that your work was dropped in a Balinese context. And I think, you know, for me, like reading these reviews of your work, and we've talked about this, it is interesting to see, like, again, perspective, how you view yourself and how others view you. And in between that process of mediation is really interesting because it's how you are very intentionally, as we've heard, like communicating or not communicating certain things through artistic strategies. So I think in that sense, it is interesting that people are still latching on to these things, you know, like through almost like a force of will sometimes, like they're like really want to see it. I guess that was what came up again for me, like after our conversations. But I wanted to ask a little bit about, like, you know, this process of this like perspective that you have on the work. And, you know, you were talking about this as well, like shifting between contexts. And I wonder if now, like being back in New Zealand, like how do you feel about these kinds of shifts, like in your perspective as an artist? Has it changed since like the 2006 work until now, and like how has it changed?
Yeah, I mean, it's like, you know, you say a lived practice. I think so much has changed since that 2006 work. I think like at the time I was making a work that, you know, and that's why, well, I make art, I guess, is like I couldn't put into words, or I couldn't fully understand. Yeah, I guess in a way where I belonged, to put it simply, or how do you know, like, until I went and met my family when I was 15, my only experience of Indonesia, or Bali particularly, was kind of travel brochures and the flight center catalogs, you know, so I had this very exoticized view. And kind of growing up in New Zealand, you do get exoticized, you know, like these kind of terms like the best of both worlds, and you represent different things for different people. And it's taken a long time for me to navigate my relationship to place, to work out how in some way to be okay with the distance, but also nurture the intimacies. I think it's taught me I approach my relationship to my heritage, I guess, carefully, and and slowly, conscientiously. I'm, you know, I want to, take care of that kind of these kind of oscillations between intimacy and distance. And it's taken me a long time to see that as a way that I can be with with being from New Zealand, but also being Indonesian. And I think actually it's in a way, being in London has been really great for me, because it's almost nice to have distance from New Zealand as well, and kind of working through this approach. It's like distances upon distances, I guess, or something. But you know, beyond that, I guess this kind of this question that has been so deep in my life is, and that I've, you know, had spent my life negotiating, is something that I really has given me a way of approaching all my subjects when I make my work, whether it be the 3 films I made before the Painted Tailor were on 3 different mystic practices, an autobiography by the English mystic Marjorie Kemp, A Secret Language by the German mystic Hildegard of Bingen, and The Interior Castle by Teresa of Avila. And this kind of being comfortable with distance and closeness, or working out how to play in that space, enables me to approach subjects in my film in a way that I hope allows for transparency and opacity. I think it's like endless, it's ongoing, it shifts, but I can definitely see there's been such a massive change between Matnik and the Painted Tailor. And also, I guess, I have this series of instruments which are based on the Balinese gamelan, or this idea that traditionally each village had its own slightly different pitch, so you couldn't play one instrument from one village and the instrument of another. And so I really love this idea of place being inscribed by a very particular frequency of community and surroundings. And for me, so I decided to create this orchestra, which I guess is my way of creating place, which each instrument is named after a collaborator. I work with different people to make them. Some are made for different shows, and they come together at different times. And it's an inscribing of place via frequency and community for me. I think it's a very different shift from Matnik, which was sometimes I think Matnik's a bit sad, you know, like the title comes from the space race. The Russians would send stray dogs into space because they felt that they could adapt better to the conditions of space, and so the Americans nicknamed it Matnik. So I think the title kind of says it all, really, or something. But I'm not sure if that answers your question, but
no, it totally does. I think you brought up the second point, which is like your really extensive work on mystic women, and like, do you feel like that is a strategy for you to, like, you know, put the distance between? Because I feel like I think you talked about this, like, actually your work is really a documentation of that distance. For me, like, that's what your work resounds the most with, is like, when you experience it, it is an experience of distance, you know. Do you feel like because that is not something that maybe, you know, you would think of when you think of like Southeast Asia or like Indonesia, you wouldn't think of like mystic women?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I guess I was just really drawn to the somatic quality of these texts, where the body kind of moves the writing. And like with Teresa of Avila, you have these like very kind of long, deep, beautiful thinking that's kind of fractured by the aches and pains of her body that kind of break into the text. And it's this very kind of Baroque texture. And this, what I loved was this translation of what the impression that another leaves on the body, and this attempt to translate that impression, and also this kind of it's always kind of this, you know, translation is a coming to terms with distance, but it's precarious, it slips, but it attempts anyway, you know, it makes an attempt to kind of bridge that space. And I think, a lot of my titles use hyphens in them because I like this idea of the hyphen as something that marks the space, but it also, you know, bridges it. It brings two entities together, but it doesn't mix them. They still. So I guess like calling the title The Painted Tailor. My grandfather was a painter, and when he needed money, he was a tailor. And I guess I use the hyphen in a way. I like to keep those. I mean, it's a very kind of basic example. I have other titles that have hyphens, but as a way of keeping those elements separate. But
I guess on that note, I was really interested, you know, we're thinking about these like connections between the many different facets of your work. My next question for Jaya was like thinking about how all of these different really specific research that you're doing in the Global South community, like how does that feed into your work at Coventry? Because you're an assistant professor at Coventry. And I wonder, like, in your, what do you do there? I mean, it would be helpful to share with everyone attending, and also like to share, like, you know, do you teach, do you do research, and how does your work feed into the audiences who you're speaking to in the most immediate context?
Thank you, Bing. Yes, I'm an assistant professor here at a research center. It's called GLEE, Global Learning, Education, and Attainment. It's a center for critical education, but they hired me to be part of a theme on gender and equality, and I'm happy to report that they've given me so much autonomy to do research in education, but at the same time, you know, do the same things that I've been doing, especially from the trans perspective. You know, my background has been, and it remains to be, in literature, comparative literature. That was my PhD in New York. But you know, personal circumstances and my involvement in the community has hybridized that positionality of being in a discipline that's imperial and patriarchal at the same time, capitalist too. So while I still do literature, comparative literature, and contemporary art as well, my backgrounds in BCall and my contemporary engagements have grounded me to always temper these tendencies of embodying habitudes that are inherent in the Western paradigm. You know, I temper them with a sense of history and community. So right now, I'm currently developing a bit for trans pedagogies in the UK. You know, but with an art dimension. We want to. We're gonna, in the bid, we are going to write in a residency to be populated by by trans artists themselves who are in education, so that we can create a toolkit for you know, various educational providers in the UK. You know, studies have shown that you know, it is most powerful to have instructional materials on trans and gender diversity, authored by trans people themselves. So that's one. That's what I'm doing in the UK. I'm planning to do a more global approach to trans pedagogy through my involvement in Brazil, in the various communities that I revolve around in Brazil. There are trans-led schools, of which art is very much a fundamental aspect of the activism and community work. And in Latin America, in Argentina, in Chile, and other parts of the continent, those trans schools have been most potent in influencing policy and contemporary culture. Very much inspired by what's going on in other parts of Asia as well. I've mentioned Bangladesh and Pakistan, and of course, the trailblazing example of our sisters in Indonesia, in Jakarta. So I do plan to constellate and coordinate these projects, because I very much feel the trans aesthetic is trans pedagogy. The moment a trans woman transitions or decides to become herself, it involves so much art, and art as a political statement, because it is, we talk about makeup, I mean, every trans woman is an artist as she begins discovering herself through makeup, even if it's in the context of drag, or everyday life, yeah, I mean, I never see divisions or demarcations. I only see, to quote Sri, hyphenations between and among art and academe and community work, because these are the spaces which trans and gender diverse people traverse. I mean, art is not foreign to gender diverse folks, because it is a medium, it is a tactic by which they can, we do empower and affirm ourselves.
Thank you, Jaya. I think it's a good place to also remind everyone watching that you're free to please ask any questions at any point, and we'll definitely get to it. I think, Jaya, you mentioned, bye, Farah. You mentioned, Jaya, that, your background is in comparative literature. And I know, this is something that I really wanted to, when we were all here together, to ask both you and Sri, because I know text is so important in Sri's work. And I think you did mention at the end that, that notion that a poem can be a temple, or can hold other things. Could you both say a little bit about how text is important as a form in your work? So we're thinking how does it manifest, what your intentions are with your practice? Maybe Sri, Jaya?
The poem, yes. The poem is a sacred text for me. This is a point of conversation between myself and Sri. As I begin to historicize transness and gender diversity in the Philippines, this has been said before, but it's only recently that I examined these chronicles written by foreign travelers, by men from the empire, and they've always cited these instances of gender diverse high priestesses, which were considered women by the community. So trans women, alongside cisgender women, were considered sacred figures in the ancient community. And that is what we're trying to to recuperate in feminist terms to combat imperial patriarchy and capitalism. And these women would, a part of their accoutrements of divinity was the poem. You know, there's always a part in the sacrifice or in the ritual where the woman, the sacred woman, would incantate and construct a text, you know, and extant pieces of these texts show a high degree of poetic lyricism and narrative import, because as they execute the ritual, they're able to summon the language of the community and its armature of beauty, as well as a rhetoric of war against evil. So that is why, as a trans woman writing poetry, I've written poetry for many years now. Let's say 25 years. But it's only recently, as a trans woman, that I rediscovered the poetic of sanctity and divinity. I've only been mining it from that history, and summoning my grandmothers and mothers from the past with that poetic tradition. You know, it's very difficult to write poetry without the archive, without the library, without my dictionaries. You know, I mean, that's part of my armature, you know, as a person of language. But I'm also very much possessed by this kind of distance and proximity to tradition, that I'm only mining the language of the past and the present, of Tagalog and Bicol, from my memory of it, and from my notions of futurity that involves a utopia, so to speak, of transness, that involves women like me, and the vortex that I've discovered, you know, the time machine that enables me to access, you know, the ancient past, the post-colonial present, and a fully decolonized future is the poem. You know, I mean, it's a vortex of trauma, of dreams, of desire, and so much imagination that whenever I enter that space of the poem, there are many terms for it: tula, balak, rawit, dawit, and employ vernacular notions of metaphor, talinghaga, tayutay, hulagway. You know, it's so beautiful to summon these vernacular terms. I very much enter that space of priesthood, of priestesshood. These women were artists, were priestesses, but also scholars. You know, I mean, there's so much wisdom, and critics of the community that can be mined from that particular trans memory.
That was so, I feel like Shri, that's like so like resonant with your work in so many ways. Oh, you're on mute, Shri.
Yeah, Jaya, I just want to meet up with you when I'm back in the UK. That was amazing. Like, I just want to chat more, but I was like, yeah, my heart was racing when you were talking. I think, yeah, I mean, I really connect with what you are saying, and I think I have quite, you know, my first, I guess, relationship with language was via religion, so quite different in a different space. I was raised in an evangelical Christian house, so which it was a very kind of, it took a long, it took a lot to get out of, but the one thing that allowed me to leave it was a poem, and it was the Song of Songs that is in the Old Testament, which is basically a celebration of erotic love. And I remember being so compelled by it as an 8-year-old and kind of obsessed with it, and just so enamored of this kind of mystery that it held, that as an 8-year-old I couldn't quite understand, and the voluptuousness of it and the enjoyment of it. It's kind of smuggled in amongst a lot of law and judgment that I was struggling with at the time. And it was like a window. Like I feel like it's like the Death Star. The Song of Songs is like the thing that kind of explodes the Death Star. The kind of like, sorry, yeah. But there was this song of enjoyment, of love, of beauty, of pomegranates, breasts and fawns, and that so compelled me, and I guess started my journey out, which was long and traumatic. But I was drawn by the song and what it held, and I think language has always, and poetry has always maintained that kind of magic space for me, or that kind of, poetry was an escape route for me, and I'm very, very, I'm grateful to it. And I think it, and I guess I only recently, I think, discovered a love of writing myself, which I used to dance, and I find that actually writing, and when I write, it comes from a similar place in my body as where my dancing used to come from. So yeah, it's still something I'm exploring and enjoying, and as a part of my practice. Yeah, but
it's interesting that you brought up the dance tree, because you were, if I'm not wrong, you were trained as a ballet dancer for almost a decade, right?
Mm.
So that's not just dancing, that's that's like a very disciplined form of performance. And I think the thing that struck me was, like, you perform a lot sometimes in your work. I'm thinking of like the mystic works, the films about the mystic women. But could you say a little bit more about like how text figures in the work itself, like maybe through a script or maybe it doesn't? And is there an intention? Because when you talk about dance, then it brings up that kind of false choice again between like orality and textuality, like the technologies of the self, like
yeah, I mean, I kind of talk about ballet as colonizing my body. It's such a rigid discipline. It's and I think there's arguments about this, but historically it comes from sword fighting. So it has this kind of history of warfare and violence, and it's like I did it from the age of 7 to 15, so my whole body is kind of constructed by this Western system of moving. So when I've actually also, I just started performing quite recently, only in the last 4 or 5 years. I'm still also working that out. I think the text in my films operates differently. I think when I appear in my films, or if I'm performing something in my films, it's something that words can't say. And then when I use words or a script or subtitles. It's a tool that's doing something that I think they operate quite differently in my work. But it's still kind of new. I mean, I think text in my work is quite new, so I'm working it out. I'm becoming more confident with it, I guess, or something. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm just thinking of the review that you but we don't have to talk about that, but I think, you know, like, I think because you've done so much work on the mystic writing, I think that is maybe like a process, right? Like studying the writings of these women from the Middle Ages, and in that way, kind of, that's what I kept thinking about when Jaya was talking about studying writings that have come before. And in a way that, again, is so somatic, as you were talking about, like this idea that, you know, there's a split, but actually, I think in both of your work, it is so like imbricated. I think, oh, we have a comment, a question. So Hi Nuning from Kunchi in Jogja. And Nuning says, "Dear Jaya, thank you for the inspiring talk. I'm really interested in trans pedagogy and the ideas to develop a toolkit and a trans-led school." And I think that, you know, she brought this up because like it really resonates with what Kunchi's School of Improper Education is doing with toolkits. So I think that's something that I thought of as we're talking as well. I think maybe Nuning, do you want to say something more about it or no? She's here.
Hi. No, I just appreciate if Jaya can speak more about it, because we've been talking about toolkits and with my colleagues at Kunji, and it's just really excited and happy to hear you talking about toolkits and then
What are you talking about?
Sorry, it's just my daughter making a quick appearance. Yeah, would like to hear what your strategies, maybe local trans pedagogies that would be inspiring and you would like to use in the toolkits. Yeah, anything about it.
Yes, thank you. Do I call you Nuraini or Nuni? Nuni.
Yeah, Nuni.
Thank you for that. I mean, oh yes, this is an exciting field. You know what? I grew up with a bilingual education, which was quite schizophrenic, because it, to begin with, it left out Bicol, my mother tongue. You know, when I was growing up, it was forbidden to speak the mother tongue in school. You only had to, we were only encouraged, actually it was sanctioned, you know, to speak in English and in Filipino. And with that particular dichotomy, Tagalog, Filipino, and English, there was so much trauma burgeoning in a little kid like me, because the textbooks were, let's talk about gender. The textbooks were sanctioning a binary, you know, like on the one hand, Filipino had a gender neutral, pronomination, but English was very much rigid about he and she, you know, and to a kid like me and to many other children growing up who were not, Bing talks about non-binary methodology, and that's very inspiring to me. So, I began with a certain notion of non-binarity, that I could be both, or I could be outside he or she, because the vernacular, the national language, was encouraging me to be a particular ungendered subject, you know, or free of gender. But at the same, so the pronouns were accompanied by certain pictures, of a she and a he, and the Filipino textbook would, even without he or she, would replicate that particular pictoriality. So a trans pedagogical toolkit would break that particular binary right away. I'm reviewing teaching materials from, let's say, the American period in the Philippines, and it's amazing that boys and girls, are delineated not just from the pronoun, but also through fashion. Boys wearing shorts and girls wearing skirts, boys having short hair and girls having my long hair right now. So a trans pedagogical toolkit would queer everything down, would break everything down, and up to these notions of let's say fairy tales. There are I have examples of trans and queer literacy frameworks where these pronouns are broken down, are broken apart through word association, through poetry, because poetry is the most powerful form of language, and at the same time, its rudimentariness also teaches children to break certain boundaries, or rigidities. So and more advanced modules in the toolkit would present and propose queer and trans fairy tales where, for example, a prince can marry another prince, a princess need not marry, and just form a coven of other princesses. So, pedagogy comes from the Greek word, pedagogos, which meant a slave, that accompanied a more privileged child to school, and notions of pedagogy from Brazil, by Paulo Freire, propose that we need to instrumentalize back tools which colonize our bodies and consciousness. And I think the most inspiring examples of queer and trans pedagogy come from the Global South. And your city, Jakarta, has so much to teach us in the world. So I'll be happy to speak more on this with you, Nuning, and perhaps develop frameworks in the future with you and Kunchi.
Thank you, Jaya, and thank you, Nuning. I'm very happy to connect both of you after this by email, because as you were talking about the toolkits, this is kind of like one of the first times I've heard about this in your work. I immediately saw Nuning's box and I was like, oh, you both have to talk about this. But Jaya is doing the important work. Jaya is a mother to the children of the world. So she's doing the important work now.
Okay.
I think, okay.
Thank you for baptizing me as mother today.
Yeah, some of us can't do it, but it's not the job for everyone. So, that it's the work that you put in. So we have, Tini has a really great question, actually. She is asking, so Tini is curator of the Jakarta Biennale 2021. And she's also curator at the National Gallery. She's an amazing curator to me. She says, I'm just wondering that you have both spoken about a certain decoloniality of knowledges and the systemic biases of artistic representation through the final form of artwork or poems. And I'm just wondering if you would have considered strategies to create access to a public of uneven, if not understanding, create access to uneven understandings. And what does it mean to remove the magic of the concealer? maybe I feel like there's like two parts to this really good question. The first is like the sense of like a decoloniality of knowledge and system. And I wonder if maybe like we can think about that together as a panel, because I feel like that's definitely, you know, Jaya is definitely talking about it, and I think Shri, you're also thinking about it in a different way. Like maybe I feel like a good access point would be to talk about like your work in the region itself, or like in specific region, as a kind of starting point. And maybe Shri, you want to talk about like, I think for you, the work in Bali is so personal as well. It's like a day-to-day, you know, taking the daily morning walk with your father, and like how you see that informing your work that is different than your other works.
Yeah, I think, I mean, for me, it was a way of learning about a history of art that I wasn't taught in New Zealand. That, you know, I went through at a time pre-internet, and it was very, you know, I found it so difficult to find artists that I, you know, really connected with. And I think Jaya mentioned something about when it somehow you feel it's not for you, or this history or these stories or certain, they're not for you. And I kind of, I guess, very strongly felt that. And I think, yeah, just the film was also about learning about this history of making that my grandfather was part of, but in a way learning about it through the stories of my father, through this very kind of everyday way, how he used to make, what his materials were. He used to, like, you know, stay up drinking coffee and reading the Ramayana, and then at a certain point we kind of went to the museum and filmed in there secretly. You weren't allowed to film, and we kind of worked out a way of smuggling in the camera and recording. But I think, yeah, it makes me aware of, I guess, how specific the history is that I, you know, grew up with, how institutionalized I am as a maker. And I think, yeah, sorry, I'm not sure of that.
No, it's important, I think, because it's the work again that you're doing to, you know, figure out, as you said, like it's a figuring out of the practice. I think an artist, I think it was Ming Wong, once told me that if, you know, he makes works to kind of, the works are like kind of trying to figure out the questions, right? So I think I paraphrased it really poorly, but, you know, that's kind of what I got from it. Jaya, do you have any comments about the decoloniality of knowledge system? And also, like, I think maybe then, you know, we can talk about like the strategies to create access points to a public understanding of the work that you both do.
Yeah.
Yes, I'd like to.
Yeah. So just to add on to this, like with regards to access point, because I realize that some of your reference points do point towards like heteronormative genders, and also like to a certain extent categories. And I think like the question here is like when works like that are presented, like within a museum or something, there is a context of like whether in white cube or coloniality or in a state institution. And what would be the considerations that you take with regards to such presentation and creating of access?
I understand that D in decolonial as a form of choreography. I mean, it's to borrow from Shri. It's like it's dancing with, I mean, the category of the colonial and its realities as it seeps into the capillaries of culture, and lived out by bodies. Yes, in a way, trans, queer are colonial categories as well, especially as mediated by, say, for example, the discourse of pride, I mean, and many activists have argued, I mean, while there is something productive about the discourse of pride, it seems as if we are always already summoned by New York every time July comes up. June, I'm sorry. My sense of time has been, in a sense of disjuncture right now. But it is, so, I mean, yes, it is powerful to think of myself as a trans woman, I mean, but there are moments where I feel I am more than a trans woman, because my history, as it's in synchronicity with most of Southeast Asia, the gender diverse experience there, I mean, says something about womanhood, but moments where gender diverse people employ womanhood to talk about and become more of themselves. So, I mean, in that particular mode or gesture, there's a sense of choreography in which you have to embrace these modernist notions of identity, of subjectivity, but at the same time, you step back from them, or you advance toward certain mechanisms from your own culture that enable you to move forward away from queer or trans, while carrying this particular weaponry to combat prejudice and violence in the world. So that's the first point. But we need SOGI. We need these terms: gay, lesbian, asexual, trans with an asterisk, a Philippine X with an X, like Malcolm X, like Chicken X, but you're right, Chinyi, we need these things to ground themselves in a community, right? So this is my call for artists and for authors to decolonize notions of authorship, of the poem or the artwork belonging to them and them only, and accessing or reaching a sense of privilege and recognition whenever their work gets published on a page or exhibited in the museum. I think the book and the museum must remain, but in concert with the community. And that is why we should aspire toward transgenre, to a transgeneric aspiration to be trans as artists, to always explore articulations in spite of certain disciplinary or artistic habits. And this is where multimedia, this is where installation, this is where video enables artists to collaborate. Cinema is a moment of collaboration. If you depart from auteurism, and this is where when art is really much in conspiracy with academia, because there is art that is sanctioned by academia, and for the most part, we have shunned the community. Activism and academia have existed side by side in harmony, but not always in conversation and collaboration. So we should explore capacity building activities in communities and summon as many gender diverse artists and their allies to talk about gender in the most fundamental, rudimentary terms. And I think art possesses the tools, to enable that particular paradigm to work. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
Thanks, Tini. I think I went, as you were talking, I kind of thought back to what Sri was talking about in the Painted Tailor work, where like the sense of authorship and the sense of understanding and comprehension of her grandfather's painting is perplexed through the different technologies of film, but also through the different actors, who are documenting, reflexively the work. And I think in that sense, I think this is a new conversation that we're having, Shri, but like I'm obsessed with the animals in your work because there's so many animals. There's the rat, there's the insects, I don't know if the insects are animals, but they're there. And then there's the bats, the bat sounds, which basically layer the work. And then the dogs, who document and haphazardly the house and your surrounding, the habitus. I wonder if that is something that you've thought about in your work, like, the voice of or the figure, the specter of the animal as a way to diffuse the authorship, like central authorship. I think you're on mute.
I'm muted. Yeah, I think I never thought I was an animal person, and then all of a sudden animals started appearing in my work. But I realized for me, I think the animals represent this like kind of really unknowable life force, they constantly and I have collaborated with like a rat, like I did a performance called Tasseography of a Rat's Nest, where I discovered this rat on my windowsill outside my bedroom. And my first instinct was to kind of like scream and like, I was like, maybe I should just push it off. And then I was like, why would I do that? What is it in me that is afraid of this thing? And then I kind of watched this rat over a course of time. I was quite lonely at the time, so it was quite useful, but I ended up kind of using the leaves from the rat's nest, like plucking out a few each day, not to disturb it so much, and photographing them and using tea leaf reading, kind of, to write a future with this rat. And it kind of, I guess I see that as kind of not collaborative, but and then Alaska with the film was a way of kind of, I guess, bringing in a perspective that is non-human, that it's not even, it's the body that is moving and the way the animal's body is experiencing that space. And yeah, I've forgotten the question. I'm really sorry.
No, I'm really curious to hear more about the way that animals function in your work, or if you have thought about it in that way. I mean, I'm just thinking about the insects, the one that Adrian Vickers talks about in your grandfather's, well, not specifically in relation to your grandfather's painting, but in his book on Balinese painting. And the one is basically like emptiness, right? But he's kind of, you're kind of talking to this art historian who's thinking that maybe your grandfather used the insect to represent the emptiness. And then, thinking about the tasseography of the rat's nest, like to divine the presence of an absent animal. That is really poetic. It's like the layers of like distance that you put between yourself and this animal that's literally right on your balcony is kind of poetic. And then, you know, the dogs, where you can and you cannot see them, but then they are such an integral function in the film. They hold in their body the camera to see, but also to not see. And then the bats as like a kind of totally unseen and unheard presence, like you wouldn't even figure out, because they make sounds that we literally cannot hear, but then you try to hear it. So there is that sense of you know, a really productive futility in the work. And I wonder if you thought about animals, like really specifically, as a way to kind of, you know, distance, to the strategy of distance in your work.
Definitely, yeah. I mean, definitely, it's, you know, one of my kind of earliest works that had an animal in it was this experience I had in a graveyard. Was about this experience I had in a graveyard with where I encountered a snake, and my body went into complete. It was this kind of very strange. I've never experienced my body in this way, but it went into complete. I guess. It wasn't flat, it just went completely still, and I lost all vision, and sound became really heightened, and that moment, I think, really shifted a lot of things for me. I experienced my body as a creature, like as one creature responding to another, in this way that was felt completely kind of animal. All words left my head, and there wasn't fear. It was just this total kind of response to another creature in my own animalness. And then it took a while for language to kind of enter, and that's when fear happened. It was like me, snake, shit, kind of. Sorry, but so I became really interested in this kind of life force that is just kind of pure animal or something, this thing that is outside of language, that isn't kind of constructed by words, that is this kind of layer, this life force that lies under everything, that in that moment, I guess, in this kind of response to the snake, I felt no difference, I guess, or something. Is the way, you know, it's so hard because it's such a strange experience, and now I'm translating it, you know, and it's being, and every time I tell it, the story's different. But I made a film about this experience, and at the time I was really lucky to meet this herpetologist who had just discovered a snake in Peru, and it was sitting on his desk, and it hadn't been named yet. So I was looking at this entity that had been pulled into our language, and so I think the animal does, in my work, represent this kind of, I guess the way I see it, this life force that is kind of moves through everything. And I guess in the same way that, the Aeon, and I'm probably pronouncing it wrong, and that's embarrassing, but has been translated into the insect by my grandfather, this abstract concept, becomes this buzzing insect.
It's really it kind of like speaks to what you're talking about earlier in your kind of like you know, that your work is layers of distanciation, you know, like you meet a snake, but you don't document it, and then you speak to someone who has discovered a new species but has not named the snake. So I mean, like, it's just so like, it's like an endless chase, you know, like you're constantly chasing. But I think that's the thing, is the lack of resolution in the work is really interesting. But then also on the other hand, like seeing the reception of the work, to go back to Tini's question, that is also an interesting phenomenon to see that the strategies maybe have fallen on deaf ears. They're continuing to read intention and particularity in what is an attempt at universalisms. I mean, going back to a kind of politics of universalism, right? That Jaya was talking about as well, like, the category of trans versus a kind of like contextualizing of that category, or a surpassing, or a kind of scalability of the category is really interesting. I think it also kind of brings me back to what Jaya was talking about, how to have a methodology of transness or queerness, especially within the academe, or within the discipline of art making, which I think that both of you really do, in the sense that we are accountable to a certain ethical framework, but we're also thinking beyond a demarcation, beyond a kind of fixity. So I really appreciated that you brought that up, Jaya, because that is something that we need to think about. And I think in my practice, that's something that I try to do, is to create eclectic constellations that whether it's art and source material, or ideas, or diction, like text, and context, like scenes, different scenes that are committed to the same cause. So that's something I really resonated with. I think maybe, do either of you have anything to add? We have 10 more minutes.
Yes, I find Tini's final question about what does it mean to remove the magic of the concealer? It touches me to the core, because I think that's an ethical question. I mean, the first moment for trans identity is, of course, an articulation of beauty. A beauty that affirms the core, the soul, the spirit, so that the body can finally cohere with who you are inside. And there's so much power in how trans women and trans men affirm themselves aesthetically, artfully, so that the artifice becomes nature itself, so that nature becomes one, upon, the body itself speaking, through fashion, through makeup, through posture and poise, But Tini's question is it's a deconstruction of that particular aspiration toward womanhood or masculinity as well. And although it is an important aspect of the history of the community, passing or stealth, because some people, when they get discovered, get hurt or killed. So they'd rather meld into cis heteronormativity, for that matter. It is a decision of life and death. But at the same time, it is an ethical decision to come out, to become, as Laverne Cox would say, to say with so much pride and articulation from within it, to say that trans is beautiful, to be both beautiful and trans. So I think that's not to say that trans women should stop being beautiful, not at all. It just means one needs to speak from a point of humility and vulnerability, to say that this beauty is born out of violence and multiple deaths, right? So there's a moment in the prose of beauty, of trans beauty, to call it pedagogy, of telling, of truth telling, that one attests to the path of pain, that led one to that particular pinnacle of beauty, but at the same time, recognizing that while one can remain beautiful with art as an ally in this particular journey, that beauty remains susceptible, right, to harm along the way, because as we know it, prejudice remains at every intersection, of, the moment you come out. This is something that I experienced in Manila, not in the Britain anymore. I hope not. The moment I came out of my apartment, there is violence. You will be hailed, in a certain way that people do intend to hurt and kill you. So that is when you say, yes, right, I am this person, but I'm not concealing myself, right? But there is a reason to this apparition.
Thank you. That's just most poetic and sensitive. Yeah. Okay. So I think at this point, we got about 7 minutes left to the session, and I was just gonna possibly see whether there's one last question from the floor or Facebook.
I think maybe I would like to add, I think Jaya brought up the really important point about disclosure, between the work that both you and Shri does. I feel like that's totally there. And, it's an interesting conversation that we've been having, because it's totally, in my, view, different strategies. Jaya brought up the notion of the politics of passing, and what Alakara Rosenstone talked about, post-transsexuality, right? The political act of not passing. This is a canonic trans studies text, and then the ideas of what that means for a conception of the self, the wholeness versus the part, what do you disclose? And then there's all this kind of the medicalization of trans bodies. I mean, there's a whole history to it. So I appreciate that you brought that up. Also, because I think for Shri, the idea of disclosure is so political, is what you disclose and what you don't. And I think that, if I may, what I gathered today is really the sense that there is intention for both of you about where and how you disclose through your cultural work. So I just wanted to say that. But I would love to hear from Rachel or Chita.
No questions from the floor, it seems. But anyway, I just would like to extend our very our thanks to you, Bing, for organizing such a beautiful panel, and also to our speakers today, Jaya and Sriwhana, for stepping in and for also speaking so poetically, what we think about with regards to diaspora and how it can be mediated across different categories, in terms of how we use the vocabulary that we talk about. It is definitely something of interest that we are working about, in the Jakarta Biennale, when we think about vocabularies and vernaculars, what we're trying to think for tomorrow, and in terms of strategies of how to handle it, particularly because of the COVID situation. And I would like to thank you all once again for contributing to our blog. And if it's any possible that we may meet one day in person, I would also be very, very, very honored to be in your company. I have met Sriwhana before, but the rest, yeah. In other means, I'd just like to round up the session. This session is actually supported by Plus Jakarta and Joy Jakarta, the Ministry of Education and Culture, Fund for Art and Ecology, and jointly held with the Jakarta Arts Council. We will be hosting these events on a monthly basis. And definitely, if you're interested into what we're up to, please click on the Jakarta Biennale Instagram, and we'll keep you informed as to what are the different discussions that we have coming right up. Without further ado, thank you all for joining us on a Tuesday afternoon, Monday evening for both our speakers who have taken the time to come and join us. Well, Tuesday evening, I think.
Morning and evening.
Morning and evening. And also, thank you all for once again joining us on this program. And we look forward to seeing you in one way or another, whether at the Jakarta Biennale or through our programs that are coming up. Thank you.
Thank you, Tini. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.